At 3 a.m. over Caracas, this was not war as we usually imagine it. No rolling bombardment, no cities going dark, no shock and awe. Instead, helicopters slipped through narrow corridors in the air. Targets were chosen, not saturated. And within hours, Nicolás Maduro, the man who had ruled Venezuela for years through fear, patronage, and force, was gone. This was not about destroying a country. It was about removing a person. What you are seeing here is power exercised with restraint. Violence calibrated, not unleashed. A military operation designed to look less like an invasion and more like an arrest. And that should make you pause, because when a superpower chooses not to use all the force it has, that decision is never accidental. It is a signal. If you want to understand how modern power really works, why sometimes what is not hit matters more than what is, stay with me. Because this story doesn't begin with the raid. It begins with the problem the raid was meant to solve. What happened in Caracas forces us to confront a harder question. Why did the United States choose this kind of operation so narrow, so precise, so deliberately limited, when it clearly had the capacity to do far more? Because this was never just a military problem. It was a political one. For years, Venezuela had become a paradox. A state hollowed out by corruption, yet still standing. A regime isolated internationally, yet entrenched at home. A military weakened by neglect and cronyism, yet essential to keeping order. Toppling the system outright would have created chaos. Leaving it untouched would have meant accepting failure. So Washington chose a third path: remove the apex, preserve the structure. This is the logic of modern intervention. Not regime destruction, but regime manipulation. Not total victory, but leverage. The raid was designed to answer one question only. Can you change a system by extracting a single node? To understand why that question mattered so much, we need to step back before the helicopters, before the missiles, and look at how Venezuela arrived at this moment. To understand that moment, you have to understand the system that preceded it. Venezuela did not collapse overnight. It decayed slowly, predictably, structurally. Years of economic mismanagement hollowed out the state. Oil revenues became political oxygen, not investment capital. Institutions weakened, but power concentrated. And the military evolved not into a modern fighting force, but into a patronage network. Training suffered, maintenance declined, corruption filled the gaps. Over time, the armed forces learned to perform loyalty, not readiness. They trained in the open because it was easier. They planned for ceremonies, not contingencies. And they depended increasingly on external actors, Cuban advisors, foreign equipment, political protection. This produced a fragile equilibrium. The regime survived not because it was strong, but because no one challenged it directly. Until the challenge came from a form of power Venezuela was never prepared to face. Precision, intelligence, dominance, and surprise. By January 2026, the imbalance was complete. And that imbalance would soon be exposed violently, but selectively. Because when systems rot quietly, they rarely collapse quietly. And the first crack came fast. The first shock was not loud. It was precise. Just before dawn, air defenses began to disappear one by one. Not everywhere, only where they mattered. At Fort Tiuna, the nerve center of Venezuela's armed forces, strikes landed with surgical intent. A mechanized unit capable of rapid movement and heavy firepower was neutralized before it could move. Emergency power systems supporting underground facilities were taken offline, and an entrance to a bunker complex was violently opened. This was not punishment. It was prevention. U.S. planners understood a simple truth. Special operations forces are lethal but fragile. If a mechanized battalion had counterattacked, the mission could have collapsed in minutes, so the system's reflexes were cut first. Elsewhere, air defense units at La Carlota, La Guaira, and Higuerote was struck not to dominate the battlefield, but to open corridors, paths in the sky, windows of time. Many Venezuelan units never moved at all. Command and control was degraded. Electronic warfare blinded response. Surprise was total. If this feels unsettling, it should, because it reveals how modern conflict is decided before most actors realize it has begun. And yet this was still the restrained phase, because beneath the visible strikes lay a deeper logic. A logic not about targets, but about systems. What made this operation work was not the explosions you saw. It was what you didn't see. The United States did not try to dismantle Venezuela's military. It did not strike headquarters. It did not sink ships in port. It did not crater runways across the country. Instead, it followed doctrine. Modern US warfare is built around corridors, not annihilation. You don't remove every threat. You remove just enough to move freely. Air defenses were hit selectively. Radars were silenced where helicopters would pass. Mechanized units that could react quickly were neutralized. The rest were left intact, watching, confused, paralyzed. This restraint was not humanitarian alone. It was political signaling. By sparing most of the armed forces, Washington was speaking directly to them. You are not the enemy. The system can survive without the man. That message mattered because the United States was not planning to occupy Venezuela. It was planning to work through what remained. This is the uncomfortable reality of power in the 21st century. Wars are no longer fought to destroy states, but to shape them. And when shaping begins, escalation doesn't disappear. It waits because even a restrained strike creates consequences, human, political, and moral. And those consequences arrived quickly. The second crisis came not from resistance, but from exposure. Even limited strikes produce damage, and damage produces truth. By daylight, the cost was visible. Air defense units lay destroyed where they had been left exposed. A communications array was gone. Residential buildings showed blast damage, and civilians, few but real, were dead. Roughly 75 people were killed. Among them, Cuban special forces who had guarded Maduro, 2 civilians whose names would never shape policy, but whose deaths would shape perception. This is the paradox of precision warfare. It promises control, but it cannot promise innocence. Satellite imagery revealed just how narrowly the strikes were focused. At ports, warehouses were hit but not ships. At air bases, runways were denied but not destroyed. At airports, a single truck was eliminated, nothing more. Everything reinforced the same message. This was not about breaking Venezuela. It was about extracting leverage. And yet, once leverage is created, it must be used. Because power that pauses too long becomes uncertainty. And uncertainty invites miscalculation by interim leaders, rival power centers, and external actors watching closely. At this moment, the operation shifted from military mastery to political risk. And that is where the stakes became personal. Because the next question was no longer about bunkers or battalions. It was about people, and if you were Venezuelan, this is where the story stopped being abstract. If you were watching this from inside Venezuela, none of the language of strategy mattered. What mattered was uncertainty. You woke up to rumors before facts. Power outages in some neighborhoods, damaged buildings in others, a president gone, but no clear sense of what came next. And that is where fear lives. Because when authority disappears suddenly, daily life doesn't become freer. It becomes fragile. You still have to go to work. You still have to feed your family. You still need order, police, electricity, food supply, transport. And all of that depends on institutions that were never designed to function without a strong man at the top. For years, Venezuelans paid the price of stagnation and repression. Now they faced a different risk, instability disguised as opportunity. If you are watching this, ask yourself honestly, How much change can a society absorb at once? This is why restrained force matters, and why reckless follow-through would be catastrophic. If you care about what happens after the headlines, about whether power is used to protect people, not just prove dominance, this is the moment to pay attention, to stay informed, to share analysis over outrage. Because what happens next doesn't just affect Venezuela, it ripples outward, and those ripples are already moving across the world. What happened in Caracas was not watched quietly. It was studied. In Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Havana, the lesson was immediate. This was not brute force. It was competence. A state removed a leader without collapsing the system beneath him. Air defenses were bypassed, not crushed. The military was intimidated, not humiliated. That matters globally because it signals a form of power that is harder to deter. You cannot easily prepare for it. You cannot rally nationalism against it. And you cannot point to ruined cities as proof of aggression. Allies noticed too. So did smaller states sitting between great powers. The message was unsettling. Sovereignty today is less about borders and more about vulnerability inside them. At the same time, limits were visible. Congress debated war powers. Opposition stirred at home. The operation's legitimacy depended not on success alone, but on restraint afterward. This is the new geometry of geopolitics. Power that must win twice, once on the battlefield and again in governance. Because the world is no longer divided between war and peace, it lives in the space between, and that space is where the future of Venezuela and US credibility will be decided. Which brings us to the only question that now matters. What happens next? From here, the future breaks into three possible paths. The first is the optimistic scenario. Leverage becomes transformation. Interim leaders make binding commitments on oil, on elections, on external ties. The military stays intact, order holds, and economic recovery begins slowly but credibly. Power is traded for legitimacy. This is the outcome planners hope for, but history tells us it is rare. The second path is muddled continuity. Promises are made, then diluted. Reforms stall. Old networks adapt rather than disappear. The system survives, but changes shape, not nature. Stability exists, but at the cost of deep disappointment. Then there is the third scenario, the dangerous one, fragmentation. Internal rivalries harden, external actors test red lines. The United States escalates or withdraws, and either choice carries risk. What began as precision becomes entanglement. These futures are not chosen by speeches. They are chosen by systems, by incentives, enforcement, and credibility. This is the lesson modern power keeps teaching us. Removing a leader is tactical. Changing a system is existential. And that distinction will decide whether Operation Absolute Resolve is remembered as restraint or prelude. Because the final judgment has not yet been written, and it will be written soon. What happened in Venezuela tells us something uncomfortable about the world we now live in. Power no longer announces itself with mass destruction. It arrives quietly, precisely, and then it waits to see what breaks. Operation Absolute Resolve was a masterpiece of execution. But execution is the easy part. The harder task begins after the helicopters leave, when leverage must become legitimacy, when restraint must hold under pressure, and when promises must outlast fear. If the United States overreaches, it turns precision into occupation. If it hesitates, leverage dissolves into defiance. Between those extremes lies statecraft, the rarest skill of all. This story is not over. It is entering its most dangerous chapter. If you want to understand how modern power really works, not as spectacle, but as system, stay with me, because the next video won't be about the raid. It will be about whether power can ever be used to rebuild what it so easily dismantles. And that question matters far beyond Venezuela.